Welcome to this very impressive public building and welcome to this important public meeting. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for conquering the booking season if you did, and for turning up anyway if you didn't. And thank you all for foregoing all of the other things you could be doing. We hope you will find it well worth it. My name is Michael Henry. I'm President of the ABC Friends in Victoria, and I welcome you on behalf of the three organisations which have combined to host this evening: GetUp, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, and ABC Friends. Three non-partisan organisations united in their concern about the increasing attacks on the ABC. There are over 400 people here this evening, probably more like 450, and many others following on Facebook, and numerous others will view the subsequent videos. The event is tapping into the large and growing community of concern for the future of the ABC. On your behalf, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to personally acknowledge with respect to the traditional owners that there are two ongoing blights in Australian society: Aboriginal deaths in custody and the disrespect shown for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We have a long way to go in our treatment of the traditional owners and their descendants. My role here is to introduce our MC for this evening, Professor Andrea Hull. But before I do that, I would like to provide a little context for the event. We invited the Honourable Josh Frydenberg, the local MP for this electorate of Kooyong. We invited him really nicely to be here tonight and to outline the government's views on the ABC. We deliberately chose this venue for tonight in order to provide an opportunity for the Treasurer, immediately before the budget, to represent the government's views. We don't know what fate awaits the ABC in the budget, but we thought it timely to offer the Treasurer an opportunity to tell us. The invitation to Mr Frydenberg was from Dr Noel Stonehouse, a local constituent, and myself. In response to the invitation, on behalf of Mr Frydenberg, his electorate office manager, Colin Rankin, indicated the Treasurer extended his apologies and asked that the following 4 points be passed on to those attending. The 4 points constitute a summary of the current government's position on the ABC. 1. The Australian government is committed to maintaining the health and vibrancy of the ABC. It recognises the importance of the ABC and the contribution its broadcasting services make to a sense of national identity, to inform and entertain audiences and reflect the cultural diversity of the Australian community. 2. With taxpayer funding of over $1 billion every year, the ABC has most financial certainty and support of any media organisation in the country. In the current three-year I'll read right through, sorry. In the current 3-year funding period, the government is providing the ABC with base funding of $3.2 billion, a substantial investment of public funds to ensure a national broadcaster continues to provide television, radio and digital media services in line with its charter. It's important to note that the ABC's budget has not been cut. ABC funding is locked in for the current 3-year period or triennium to 1920 to 21-22 and rises each year within that period. In the last budget, the ABC received a further $43.7 million from regional and local news gathering. As you may already be aware, the government provided funding to the ABC of $1046 million in 18-19, and in the 3 years of the current triennium, the ABC is receiving $1062 million, 19-20, $1065 million, 2021, and $1070 million, 21-22. 4. The content and operational independence of the ABC is enshrined in legislation. Parliament has guaranteed this independence so that the ABC's decisions are free of political interference. Under this arrangement, how the ABC spends the money allocated to it remains a matter for the ABC board and executive. The letter concluded, the government understands how much Australians value the ABC, it is committed to a strong and resilient ABC, operating efficiently and delivering the best possible outcomes with the substantial funding it receives. In the interest of transparency, we've presented these points to you as written and as requested. What you will see and hear this evening is in part a response to this letter from the Electorate Office. The speakers and panellists will outline how and why the ABC is being undermined and what we can do about it. We believe the ABC is under attack, including by the current government, and we want to fight back. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our MC for this evening, Professor Andrea Hull, AO. Andrea has held a number of important leadership positions in Australia, including as the longest-serving Director of the Victorian College for the Arts, Deputy Chair of the Breast Cancer Network and the National Museum of Australia, and she's the current Chair of the Melbourne Recital Centre. Andrea is a long-term vocal supporter of the ABC, and her most recent position was as Chair of the ABC Advisory Council. We are delighted that Andrea has agreed to MC this evening's proceedings. Please welcome Professor Andrea Hull.
Thank you, Michael. I must say it's impressive looking out on a full hall, so congratulations that you all managed to get your tickets and get here. I acknowledge the traditional owners as the original custodians of this land, including the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people in the northern part of this city, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and the elders from other communities who may be here today. And I'd like to echo Michael's comments, particularly about the Uluru Statement. Now, there's a couple of housekeeping matters. One is mobiles switched off, and the loos are behind the exit signs. I think you find your way that way. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Tosca Lloyd as our first speaker, and she's going to show a film that she made as part of her role as the senior campaign manager of GetUp's Media and Democracy team, who are fighting for issues like the ABC and media diversity. Tosca spent some time in Melbourne and she was involved in the Voluntary Assisted Dying campaign and that campaign for marriage equality. She has a Master's in Human Rights from the University College London. Welcome, Tosca.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everyone for being here. It's pretty phenomenal that there's so many people here, but not surprising considering the value of the ABC to our communities. I'd also like to say thank you to ABC Friends Victoria and MEAA for being here. It's phenomenal that our organisations, members and people from the community are here to really stand up and say enough is enough on ABC cuts. I'd also like to say thank you to GetUp members. I work at GetUp and our work is just not possible without the actions and time of our GetUp members, so thank you for being here. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight, pay my respects to elders past and present. Truth-telling is pretty critical to our communities and critical to our democracy, and it's part of the reason why we're here tonight, because the ABC is critical to the path of truth-telling in this country. But I think it's good to remember and important to remember that First Nations people in this country have been fighting for truth and justice since the start of the colonial project. And there will be no justice until there's First Nations justice, and we should remember that as we fight for truth-telling in this country. I'm not going to say too many words because it's in the film, but I don't think it's a spoiler to say that there is a coordinated anti-ABC agenda going on here in Australia, and it's seeking to diminish and destroy the ability of the ABC to fulfil its charter. You'll hear more about that in a moment, but I thought I might just make a comment about Frydenberg's comments just then. They're lies, and I think that's pretty obvious to everybody here. They're lies like in 1996 when Howard promised no cuts to the ABC and then levied a 2% cut to the ABC's budget. They're lies like Tony Abbott when he said, I'm sure you can all repeat what I'm about to say because we know it so well, but no cuts to the ABC or the SBS. And then since 2013, when he made those comments, up until the end of the triennial period next year, that'll be around a total of $783 million cut from the ABC. So these are lies, and it's the reason why we made this film. But there is hope. The government clearly knows that these cuts are no longer defensible, so they're just denying them outright. And I think that that's a credit to our movement, that we've put them in this position. But I think it's incredibly important that we keep on with the campaign that all of these organisations and people in the community have been pushing for over a decade now, to save our ABC and keep it strong for the communities that need it, and for the communities that we don't yet know about in Australia. I think I'll just probably leave it there, but I really hope you enjoy the film. I enjoyed making it with my colleagues at GetUp and the amazing people that you'll see in the film. A few of them are here, Adam, Ed, so please enjoy the film, and I'll chat to you later when I'm on the panel.
Thank you so much, Tosca and your colleagues. That was a very powerful film. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ed Davis, and for him to reflect on what the ABC does for us all, its vital role in democracy, and the attacks through funding cuts and political interference. Ed has been the president of New South Wales Friends, ABC Friends. He is an economist who specialises in industrial relations and worked at a variety of universities and is a passionate supporter of public broadcasting. He was a former National Vice President of ABC Friends, has a New South Wales Life membership, and was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2006 for services to education, industrial relations and equal opportunity. Welcome to Ed.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrea, for that welcome, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging on the lands that we meet. What a terrific film. Could we have another round of applause for Tosca? What an absolutely stunning film that makes all the points we want to make about the ABC. What a really important organisation it is, how it's loved and supported across Australia, but how at the same time it has formidable foes who are absolutely pledged to its undoing. And that's why it's so important that we're all here tonight to fight for it, because it absolutely needs it. We need strong, independent public broadcasting. And without the sort of support you're showing tonight, it's going to wither. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I always enjoy my trips to Melbourne. I live in Sydney. I began my life in Australia here in Melbourne. It's always lovely to come back. I married a Melbourne girl, a decision I've never regretted. And it's always great to see my friends in the Victorian ABC Friends. Peter, who I know is not here tonight, Marcus, Bill, Leonie. I've met Michael for the first time tonight. But they are amazing people who are committed to fighting for the ABC. I'm not going to preach to the converted tonight. We're all here because we know how important the ABC is. We all feel the distress at its whittling away, at its dismantling. We all feel anger when we hear people in the coalition talk about privatising it, and the Murdoch empire talking about how the ABC has to be sold off. Michael read out Josh Frydenberg's letter, and I find it quite touching, really, but delusional, but just delusional. I mean, I don't know where he is. I worry about the budget in his hands. This is not a man with a firm grasp on reality. There have been major cuts to the ABC. Emma Dawson did a terrific report for GetUp and went through it in some detail. Michael Ward has made the same sort of points that you saw there. But actually, just step back a bit, and I'll give you one fact that is, I think, incontrovertible. That is, since the mid-80s, the ABC has lost a third of its funding. Yet it does a lot more. Back in the middle of the 1980s, there weren't 4 radio stations and 4 national TV stations. They weren't digital. So we've got all that lot now, and we've got a third less funding. And we have many fewer staff. I mean, it's extraordinary. So yes, there have been cuts. For goodness sake, in the government, accept the fact. Say the fact. It's true. There have been cuts to the ABC. And, you know, I liked the grabs in the film where we had sort of Tony Abbott having a go at the ABC. At least you knew where you were. You know, when Peter Dutton says he hates the ABC, you think, well, that makes sense. You know, it doesn't sort of worry you. It's life as you'd expect. I do worry about him as defence minister. Does anybody else feel that? I mean, have you got your kit ready for war against China? I don't know if you're getting ready for that. Okay, the ABC is the most extraordinary asset. In some ways, it may be Australia's most extraordinary asset. It is widely recognised as a national treasure. That's one of the reasons why it's hard for the government to completely do it in, because poll after poll for year after year says that, well, 70% of Australians tune in every week and 80% trust it. Way higher trust levels than anything our friends in the commercial media can come up with. And it costs so little. I don't know if you've done the sums. David Hill did the sums some 20-odd years ago, 30 years ago. He talked about the ABC costing, in those dollars, 8 cents a day. If you accounted for inflation, it would now be 4 cents a day. But forget about that. The ABC costs $1 billion a year. Divide that by 25 million Australians, divide that by 365 days in a year, the ABC costs 12 cents a day. 12 cents a day. Now, some of you might go out and buy a newspaper, but I tell you what, you wouldn't be getting anything like the value from that newspaper that you get from the ABC. It's TV channels, it's a raft of radio channels, online, and so on. Another point I want to make, I'm terribly conscious of time tonight because we've got restricted time, but here's another really important point. For all the going on by the government and the Murdoch empire about the cost of the ABC, it is 0.13% of federal government expenditure. 0.13% of federal government expenditure. Now, frankly, you'd reckon from the discussion of our Prime Minister and Treasurer and everybody else that they could solve debt and deficit by sorting out the ABC's budget. But it's 0.13%. It's $1 billion, and the government spends $670 billion. Social security, welfare, education, defence, health, and all the rest. It's a tiny proportion. So what the attack is ideological. It's ideology. It's nasty right-wing politics. The ABC plays a massive role in underpinning our democracy. It tells truth in a world of fake news, and it holds governments to account. It holds power to account, and thank God that it does. But it faces formidable enemies. It's got what I don't think it's being unkind, but I'd describe as the crazed right of the coalition, who seem to have an extraordinary amount of influence. It's got the Murdoch empire, and it's got the coal lobby, who all work almost seamlessly together to pursue their agendas. Friends, I'm going to finish on these 2 points. There are encouraging signs. There are encouraging signs. Does that mean I've got 2 minutes or what, 2? Fantastic. There are encouraging signs. One, the ABC remains embedded in the hearts of people across Australia, particularly in the rural and regional areas that we saw tonight. Two, other parties, the ALP, the Greens, independents like Zali Steggler, they've been outspoken in support of the ABC. Now, when the ALP gets in, we've got to keep them to their promises about the ABC, but at least they were clear that they would have restored the last round of cuts, at least, if they'd won. I'm encouraged by Rudd and Turnbull coming out. Well, why weren't they braver when they were in office? You know, why weren't they braver? But they've come out now and they have been clear about the role that the Murdoch empire is playing and people trying to rein in the ABC. And it is really encouraging that 500,000 people, more than that, you know, the website collapsed for people trying to get onto it, said that they were behind an inquiry into media diversity, backing Rudd's petition. So thank goodness for that, and that's encouraging. But the other encouraging thing is here on a wet and gloomy Saturday, halls like this will fill with people who are concerned about the ABC, who will fight for the ABC, and make sure that we continue to have strong and independent public broadcasting in Australia. Your role is so important, so thank you for being here tonight. Let's stick with this fight. Let's stick with this fight.
Thank you, Ed, very much. So now we need to move on to the results of these attacks on program cuts, job losses and loss of invaluable experience, the drop in morale and the effect on the training and work for Australians that the ABC stimulates. And who better than Karen Percy, an ex-ABC journalist for over 30 years. She began her career with the ABC in Adelaide and went on to positions in Alice Springs, Darwin, Sydney, Bangkok and Moscow. She's also worked for Channel 10 and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. For 3 years, she was the ABC's Southeast Asian correspondent based in Bangkok, and in 2010 she went to Moscow and freelanced. Most recently, she was the court reporter for ABC News in Melbourne before leaving in the last round of redundancies. She's also the co-vice president of the media section of the MEAA, one of the 3 sponsors of tonight's activity, and a director of the Walkley Foundation. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight and for the opportunity to speak to you. There are 2 days that really stand out in my long association with the ABC. The first was a day in February 1987 when I got a call from the news chief of staff in Adelaide telling me that I was the new television news cadet. I was beyond thrilled, and I remember this still as if it was yesterday. The call came in the cafe in the CBD in Adelaide where I was working in between university classes. I cried with joy when I heard the news. I promptly called my parents, and my dad sent me a telegram. We were all pretty excited. It was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. I was a journalist at last. The second is September the 11th last year, my last day at the ABC. Yep, I'm one of those who was made redundant in the last round of cuts or non-cuts, whatever you want to call them. It was the strangest of times to leave an organisation that I'd been in and out of over 30 years, literally blood, sweat and tears shed for the organisation. I was at least able to be in the office with some of my colleagues. Many of them were on Zoom as well. It was a farewell for the times, I guess. During my little farewell speech and party, I guess it was, they played a highlight reel of my career. There I was in Adelaide, a fresh-faced 18-year-old. There I was in Alice Springs. There I was in Darwin, hosting the NT's 7:30 report. There I was reporting on the short-lived business breakfast program. There I was reporting on a coup in Bangkok. And there I was outside a court in Melbourne for one of the many murders I managed to cover as a court reporter. I was very fortunate to join the ABC when I did. Adelaide in the late 1980s was a hive of activity. There was productions, there were orchestras. It was the centre of the ABC's all-important children's education unit. I opened my first bank account at Collinswood. So busy and so big was that site that it could have its own credit union branch located on that site. Now Collinswood is a shadow of its former self. There is local radio, there is local news, there's some local sports, but not a lot more than that going on out of that building. Over the years, more and more floors of the building in Collinswood have been rented out to others. To be fair, a lot of media organisations in Adelaide and other centres have also gone through the same kind of contraction. No organisation is doing as much drama or putting on variety shows or music shows. In fact, there's not a lot going on in local production in lots compared to those heydays. And we've heard tonight of how crucial the ABC is in times of crisis, bushfires, floods, a pandemic. You know, imagine if we had not had the science reporting from our science team, Dr. Norman Swan, the Coronacast, the health reporting that we've all been relying on. All day, every day, ABC staff are doing everything they can to inform you, to educate you, to entertain you. ABC audiences have never been stronger, certainly in recent times. Our online presence is very impressive indeed, and our broadcast audiences are holding up. The ABC has never been more important. The ABC's investigative journalists are telling stories that are leading to fundamental shifts in our attitudes to the military and the way they conduct themselves overseas, to the way women are treated in this country. And it's not just news, of course. Children's programming continues to be top-notch. Drama too. Of course, if you've watched Wakefield or Mystery Road or The Code, you'll know how important the ABC is to local production, to actors, to crews, etc. The Old People's Home for 4-year-olds, an absolute cracker of a program. You can't ask that. Another fabulous, innovative program that the ABC has done. But we're doing a lot less of it, and we've certainly lost the ability to do a lot of this in-house. We're doing so much more outsourcing. The cuts, hundreds of millions of dollars in recent years, are nobbling the organisation's ability to effectively tell Australian stories. And the relentless bashing by politicians, media rivals and ideologues is also hobbling the national broadcaster. And that is having a huge impact on staff. I was one of 250 to leave last year, 80 of us from the news division alone. Most didn't really want to go, even if they had put up their hands like I did. But there are fewer and fewer opportunities within the organisation. Experience is no longer valued. We've lost more than 1,100 positions since 2014. And we know that more redundancies will come, either to adjust to more cuts or non-cuts, or to shift direction. Every week I'm hearing of another talented person leaving, citing a lack of career opportunities. Very little is done to keep them. I'm really lucky to have had such a rich career at the ABC. The day I left, I was blunt with my colleagues that most of them would not be so fortunate to have such a long career. There is a huge churn and burn factor in the ABC right now. Older, more senior staff are increasingly being let go or forced out, devalued, and they're replaced with younger, less experienced staff. Budget cuts mean the managers have to find savings somehow. And you can hear it, you can see it, you can read it. You know the quality isn't always what it should be. There aren't the same layers of checks and balance that there used to be. Staff are stretched so thin. They are working so hard. In spite of the huge pressures and the dwindling resources, we must not lose sight of the fact that there is a brilliant work being done at the national broadcaster. The ABC I started at is a very different ABC to the one I finished with last year, but we must continue to fight for it. I want to thank GetUp I want to thank the Friends of the ABC for their relentless campaigning, for the great work done by my colleagues at the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, but most of all, thanks to you. You're the viewers, you're the listeners, you're the readers. Please continue to support the ABC. Continue to demand the highest standards of the ABC. Continue to pressure your MPs. Continue to talk up the value of the ABC to anyone and everyone you know. This is a campaign we can't afford to let rest, because the demise of the ABC will undermine our democracy. It'll lead to further erosion of community cohesion. It will ultimately see the rise of the peddlers of disinformation or distorted, biased views, whether it's simply to make mischief, to make money, or to fit an ideology. We can't afford that to happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Our final speaker in the quartet is Jim Middleton, who is a legendary journalist with the ABC, was with the ABC from 1970 to 2014. And after a stint working for Tim Storer, the independent senator, he also worked for Sky News. So he's well positioned to cover the Murdoch versus the ABC angle. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Andrea. That's a very dangerous invitation. And I don't think I will necessarily go there, although I'm happy to answer questions about it, should anyone be interested to know. What a great roll-up this is. Fantastic to see so many people here to look after and to try to protect an institution, an organisation for which I worked for more than 4 decades and, well, loved nearly every minute of it, I've got to say. Look, the pub test, the sniff test. It's a phrase we see in the media all the time in reference to what politicians say and what they do, and whether or not what they are saying is the case actually meets with the view of people sitting around the kitchen table or at the local bar or cafe. And in the case of the question of cuts to the ABC, it's a case, I think, of does this pass the pub test? Does it pass the sniff test? It's not looking at what they say, it's looking at what has been done. Now, as Karen pointed out, 250 people lost their jobs in the last round of cuts, something like 1,100 over recent times, since 2013-14, when the coalition government came in. Now, ABC management doesn't cut jobs for fun. It doesn't do it so they can go home at night and so that Dave Anderson can say to his wife, look what I did today, I got rid of 250 jobs. That's expertise, that's value, that's experience that is lost not only to the ABC but to the community of which, obviously, of whom you are all members. It's not just that. You can look at things like the 7:45 News, no longer there, an institution, something that was one of the first things I worked on as what was called a radio sub-editor back in those days, now called a producer, putting together that news, which was one of the pillars of ABC breakfast radio right around the country, seeing PM, which was hosted for so many years by my very dear friend Mark Colvin, cut in half, chopped in half. Lateline, hosted for so many years by another very good friend of mine, Kerry O'Brien, and that has now gone as well. These are things which are irreplaceable and valuable. We all know at the ABC, whenever there are surveys about trust in the media, the ABC comes out on top. Now, there are also arguments sometimes that because all other media organisations are suffering and struggling, that therefore the ABC needs to take a measure of that of those reductions in expenditure as well. It's complete nonsense. We're living in a situation where not only do we have a regime of fake news, and we see where that got the United States, but also where the ability, if it is the case that the ability of other organisations to hold government to account, to scrutinise things, is reduced, there's no reason, in fact there's more reason than ever why it should be that the ABC should be properly funded and filled with people full of experience and expertise. Just in recent years, you can see we would not have had an Aged Care Royal Commission. We would not have had a Banking Royal Commission had it not been for the efforts of the ABC, the reporting of the ABC, and also, as Karen pointed out, that's the case too with what we're seeing as people are being held to account for what appear to have been very significant war crimes in the war in Afghanistan. None of that would have been done without the efforts of the ABC. I have to admit, in the case of the war crimes, that the reporting of Nick McKenzie and others at what is now 9 newspapers has been very significant as well. I want to, just in the brief time that I've got left, is to point to the reduction in the international capacity of the ABC, not only in the disappearance of officers in New Zealand, for example, or in Africa, and I think how much value it would have been to the Australian community to have still, for the ABC still to have had an office in New Zealand. How important is it going to be to have continuing coverage of Africa, not only when we eventually see what the ravages of COVID do to that community, which will have an impact on the Australian community and the Australian economy as well, but also as the population of Africa doubles or trebles over the next century and becomes even more important to the fate of the global economy than it has been to date. But the kneecapping of the ABC's international service, which was the organisation for which I worked last, has been one of the most egregious cases of short-sightedness by the coalition government, in my view. This was an organisation... We are now apparently in a contest with China, and if we are in that contest, then one of the things that matters is both the reputation of the nations involved and the values that they project. Now, the Australian network was the last iteration of many efforts by the ABC, most notably, of course, Radio Australia, but also previous efforts first instituted by David Hill when he was Managing Director, to project the values of Australian democracy into the region. At the time that the ABC was spending something like $10 million a year on its international service, by the time that came to an end in 2014, the Chinese were spending $600 million a year on international broadcasting. It was no contest. But by removing even that level of influence and experience, and remember the days when Radio Australia, for example, in its Beijing bureau and also in Jakarta, got thousands of letters a week from people who, from listeners and viewers, or listeners in those days, because it was a trusted source of information that they couldn't get elsewhere. They could not get it domestically, and therefore they turned to the ABC. The ABC, as a consequence, in the circumstances that now the government realises it has a problem in the Asia-Pacific in terms of Australia's reputation and its ability to project those values that we want to protect, because it doesn't have anything like the ability to broadcast, telecast, or by other means get into the region. It has made it more difficult, if we are indeed to win this contest of ideas, which the government insists that we are in with China, we don't have that ability in anywhere near the scope that we once did. I know I've taken up too much time. I will end on just one other note, which is to do not underestimate the electoral value and importance of the ABC. It was quite clear in the Eden-Monaro by-election that it was not just the case that because Eden-Monaro was at the epicentre of some of the bushfires that it had an impact on the vote in that by-election. It was also other matters, that is, people within regional New South Wales and in Canberra, or around Canberra I should say, who felt resentful at the cuts that had been and were being imposed on the ABC at the time, and it had an influence on their vote. I know it has an influence in areas like this, in Kooyong, in Higgins, in Goldstein, for example. It may not change everybody's vote, but it has an impact and will have an impact on how people vote at the next election. And the only thing I would suggest that you do is just vote for those people who want to maintain the standing and the ability of the ABC to do the job that it has been doing for over the last 80 years, serving the Australian community very, very well, and in some cases, as was certainly the case in the bushfires, saving and preserving lives. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. We've now got time for a panel discussion, and I'm inviting the three speakers up to join Jim. Now, I've had 7 questions in advance, and I'm going to go through those, and if there's time after that, invite questions from the floor. There'll be 2 mics, one there and one there, and if you could line up behind the mics when I get to about question 6. So the first question is, do you think there's been an increase in hostility to the ABC under this government? And I'll ask Jim to lead off.
Okay, let's just see whether this microphone's working. Can you all hear me? Yeah, good. Look, it's inevitable that an organisation which has part of its charter, or not part of its charter, but effectively part of its charter, is holding governments, those in authority, to account, that there's likely to be a level of antagonism, if not hostility. Now, you may recall, for example, if you go back to the first Gulf War, that Bob Hawke was very hostile to some of the ABC's coverage of the first Gulf War, and made that very, very clear indeed. But I have to say, and also, it was certainly the case that in the early years of the Howard government, when I was working in Canberra as political correspondent, that they were very difficult times, and they were not particularly friendly times, initially at least. It was interesting to see Paul Fletcher up there denying that there'd been cuts. I do recall that on election night in 1996, asking Richard Alston, who was then the incoming communications minister, whether he would guarantee that there would be no cuts to the ABC, even if the incoming government discovered that the budget was not in as good a shape as they had been told, and he said categorically no, it wouldn't happen. Well, of course, the first thing that did occur, or one of the first things that did occur, was a 2% cut to the ABC's funding, and the early days of the relationship between the Howard government and the ABC were pretty willing, I would put it, but it later turned out that the government discovered that this was not as productive as it might have expected, and Graham Morris, who was then John Howard's Chief of Staff, coined the phrase that the ABC was our enemies talking to our friends, and certainly the hostility that had been exhibited to the ABC in those early days was ameliorated. But come the arrival of the Abbott government, I'd have to say that relations started badly and have not really ever got better.
I'd add to that you know, you'll recall the various ministers, Vanstone, Downer, etc., who used to, you know, when they were on Lateline, ironically, you people at the ABC, you've got an agenda at the ABC. There was always some ABC bashing, but it's pretty extraordinary how much it's kind of really escalated recently. You know, you'll recall the altercation, if you like, between Michael Rowland and Greg Hunt. You know, there's very personal kind of attacks that are happening. So it's definitely been amped up. You know, the coalition has never liked us, but let's face it, the Labor Party didn't like. Keating wasn't a huge fan of the ABC in lots of respects because of the way we held his government to account. But it's also, there's just a different way. They weren't as vitriolic. So that's what's changed, I think.
Look, there certainly was significant hostility on the part of the Hawke and Keating governments to certain things that the ABC did, and that goes right back to 1983 when Richard Carlton asked Bob Hawke immediately after he toppled Bill Hayden, "Have you got blood on your hands?" And Hawke's response was, "You haven't changed, have you, Richard?" And so it was there, but by and large, it has to be said that Labor governments may well have had their differences and been antagonistic to the ABC, but they by and large, apart from the late 80s, did not take it out on the ABC in the form of budget cuts.
Can I just add a couple of points? I wonder if there's not been more pressure from the Murdoch and Cole lobbies in the past, say, 10 years than there'd been before. I think that might be one factor. But also, which I think underlines the point about the hostility of this government, back in 2018, some of you might have heard Quentin Dempster make this point. Back in 2018, the Liberal Party held its national conference. It held it in Sydney, and it moved by a very significant majority at its conference in, I think it was June 2018, to sell off the ABC. Now, I can't remember the coalition government proposing to sell off the ABC at earlier times.
Well, it's certainly the case that that's a qualitative shift, is it not? At the very least, yeah. Now, I don't think it's. I just don't think it's politically, electorally feasible for a coalition government to do that, and I personally doubt that any of the prime ministers that the coalition has had over the past, what is it now, 8 years, that is Abbott, Turnbull or Morrison, either themselves want to do it or would set about doing it. But that doesn't deny that there's a significant rump within the Liberal Party that would do it tomorrow if they could.
I would agree that it's not feasible to privatise the ABC, but I think, you know, one motivation for making the film in the first place was that they don't need to come out and privatise it in order to weaken it. And we've heard from Karen's own experience how a diminished ABC can happen in front of our eyes. I would add to your point, Ed, about the Murdoch press. I think that that's a really important part of the story. This last 10 years has seen a crisis in our media that's really come to a head, and we've seen that in the past year with the media bargaining code with Google and Facebook. Our media industry really is struggling. Community broadcasters, local papers are really struggling in this market with the advent of these big global giants. So it's no surprise that perhaps the lobbying from the commercial sector has ramped up to our government, and the government sitting in the day is the coalition currently for the past, oh God, it's 8 years. Count for me. Too long, I would say. That lobbying really has ramped up, and we have evidence that they meet regularly and that their interests have been guiding the coalition's media policy for some years now. And I think that's really, really important to know. Right now we have a media diversity inquiry going on, which was came about as a result of the petition that Ed mentioned, launched by Kevin Rudd, about our media industry and the role of the Murdoch press. So that's a really important part of the picture here. But even within that, even within a struggling media market, that makes it even more important that we have public services that are immune from, you know, the strains of the market, immune from whatever might be happening, that we can always have a public service there, whether it's health, whether it's public broadcast, or whether it's education. And that's why, you know, the ABC and the SBS are so critical.
Thank you. So that was question one.
You might be here a while.
The next question is, what are you hearing from your members and regional communities about how the gutting of funding is impacting their day-to-day lives? And I'll ask Tosca and Ed to address this in the first instance.
Well, we saw some of the members, GetUp members, on the screen, which told part of the story. So I won't go too much into it. I won't go too much into the bushfires. But Eden Monaro has been mentioned, and the ABC was really critical in Eden Monaro, not just because of the bushfires. I mean, you talk to anybody who lives in regional Australia. We have farmers, GetUp members who are farmers, and they rely on it for daily stock reports. Really quite critical information to run a business, especially a farming or agricultural business in rural and regional Australia. So it's not just about crises, but it's also about it's sort of this strange idea that the Nationals have that people in regional Australia somehow don't have a need for national content. And that's a real fallacy, and I think we should be careful of it, because regional Australians need both local news and local stories. They need to know what's happening in their regions and their communities. But they also need to know what's happening on a national level. We need to be listening to the same stories, watching the same drama. Our kids need to be all watching, you know, if our kids are watching Play School, it's how we learn to play together. But I think also one aspect about regional members is a complete tin ear from the National Party, a party that above all other parties should be a massive proponent of a strong ABC, and yet they are sort of doling out this line about ABC only catering for inner city communities. I mean, I'd really love to hear from Karen, I mean, about how that feels as internally at the ABC. Try so hard to cater for all these kinds of communities, wherever you are, whoever you are, and then have the National Party basically saying that you're not speaking to their communities, when the communities themselves are saying that they are. ABC journalists themselves live in these communities. Eden Monaro, there's two critical radio journalists who worked relentlessly through the bushfires. I mean, talking about 30-hour shifts keeping people safe.
Crazy. I will just add to that, you know, while the ABC has beefed up our regional presence, there's been a real push towards additional staff in those areas. Those staff are working even harder than those in the cities. As Tosca's saying, you know, hugely long hours. They're generally much more junior, the kind of responsibilities they have, they're driving here, there and everywhere. And when you're close to a community, you know and you understand acutely the impact of your reporting on those communities. So it's even more so in those community areas. But without the metro areas to be able to help train and to foster talent and to, you know, get a gig in the big times every now and again. You know, they work part and parcel. If we only had regions, it wouldn't work. If we only had the metros, it wouldn't work. So, but everybody's under strain, and that strain is increasing every day.
Thank you. Ed, do you want to comment on
Look, just only a very quick comment. Obviously, the ABC is hugely important to people across rural and regional areas. I think until quite recently, the National Party and its leaders looked reasonably fondly on the ABC because they knew that there was that sense of their electorates. So Tim Fisher, for instance, was a big supporter of the ABC. I think he signed up as an ABC friend and turned up at various ABC friend events. I have to tell you, this is sad, but Barnaby Joyce was much less obviously a friend of the ABC, and I can't quite remember his name, but the current leader doesn't seem to be fond of the ABC either.
Thanks. So the next question is one that I'm particularly interested in too. Many Liberal national ministers in this government, including the PM, Treasurer and Communications Minister, are alleged to be supportive of the IPA and its affiliates. and they want to destroy or privatise the ABC, why isn't this seen as undue influence of a government that is supposed to represent the people? Karen?
Well, it's very coincidental, isn't it? This alignment of policies, and it's not just the privatise, burn down the ABC policies. There's a whole lot of policies that the IPA has that somehow kind of turn up in cabinet meetings and caucus meetings and party meetings, it seems. So, you know, we've got governments that now just aren't accountable in the same way, so it doesn't matter if you're blatantly being directed or influenced by organisations. And I think that's a problem of the erosion of our democracy. And if you erode one of the institutions that is holding the democracy to account and our politicians to account, it's going to get all the more so. But there's certainly a lot of chutzpah amongst those folks.
Thanks. Jim, did you want to comment?
A little, yeah. Look, of course, you have a situation where you've got, leading lights of the IPA, like Senator Patterson and Tim Wilson. Obviously, they stated what they thought of the ABC when they were working for the IPA, and it's be highly unlikely that they would have shifted in that view since. But whether the IPA, I'm speaking here as a journalist rather than as an advocate, whether the IPA has overwhelming influence on the government or not is another matter. But that doesn't matter in itself. The fact that that attitude and that disposition is there makes it harder for those within the coalition who are supportive of the ABC, and believe it or not, there are quite a few of them as well, but it means that it's a contest all the time, rather than being a given that support for and financial support for the ABC is something that will or can become coalition government policy.
Can I just jump in? I mean, I think there is a problem with the undue influence of the IPA. I really do. I think that there's every right for the IPA to exist, and this is an adjacent conversation about the level of influence of certain bodies on our government, whether they be the IPA, whether they be particular lobby groups. I mean, journalism much more broadly, I think one of its really key purposes, not its only, but one of its key purposes is to hold power to account, and it's not always able to do that. Another form might be, I don't know, a federal ICAC, a corruption commission that actually lists quite transparently. Yeah. We just need to know. We need to know who they're meeting with. We need to know the level of donations. This kind of information is actually really critical to our democracy, and we don't have it in Australia. There's some great organisations who are doing work on this, Transparency International, but also the Centre for Public Integrity, who say things like MPs having diaries, just diaries, telling us who they're meeting with and for how long might be really, really instrumental in a step forward in sort of curtailing undue influence, because it really is a problem.
Tosca, I couldn't agree with you more. And the fact of the matter is that in the absence of a federal ICAC or Integrity Commission, it does mean that the burden for holding those in power and authority to account falls to the media. And because the ABC has such public trust, it means that whatever it does in this area is going to be of more worth, value and consequence than anyone else. But that doesn't remove the need for a federal integrity commission at all, but it does point to the importance of the ABC in these circumstances.
It's almost surprising that they're trying to silence it. You'd wonder why. You really would.
Now, time's getting away from us. I'm going to ask one more question and some succinct answers. The 2019 Efficiency Review, commissioned by the government and led by the former chief of Foxtel, Peter Turner, recommended the ABC be funded on a 10-year cycle rather than the current 3 years in order to give it funding certainty in a changing technological environment. What has happened to that recommendation?
crickets.
I mean, there was a few giggles when it said Foxtel. I mean, it was quite deliberately. This efficiency review was not supposed to bring back a recommendation for more funding for the ABC. The Coalition really did not like that, hence the crickets. I'll just say one comment before handing to my... Andrew called us the quartet before, I thought we'd do good as a quartet. Is that the efficiency reviews? I mean, government interference at the ABC comes in many different forms. The cuts are a particularly heinous form of government interference, but they're certainly not the only one. Janet Albrechtsen, Keith Winchuttle on the board, you'll remember that. That was another form of government interference. Efficiency reviews are another. Draining capacity, draining time, draining narrative are quite a deliberate way for the government to chip away at the public broadcaster. So cuts are not the only way. Stacked board is not, and to be honest, both parties, ALP and the Coalition, have both traditionally stacked the board on the ABC. But just note, when you hear efficiency review, think government interference. But anyone else?
Well, and the way the funding, works at the moment, the triennial, that's a deliberate thing. That's great, right? Because it means there's extra pressure in the lead up to those negotiations. So if there is going to be any kind of, pulling the foot off the accelerator, that's going to be when it's going to be. We need to be a bit more careful, perhaps. But I think that the funding's deliberate that way. They quite like the fact that they have to keep us on our toes year after year at budget time. I don't think anybody has any guarantee that come this week's budget that there's not going to be some little something for the ABC. If not this year, it'll be the next or the next or the next. It's coming at some stage, and the funding way it happens is a deliberate tool to do that.
Can I just, sorry. There is an interesting thing about the triennial, which is a little bit off topic, but it relates to Eden Monaro, back to Eden Monaro. The significance of Eden Monaro was that, the first by-election post the bushfires, and not only that, but really critical role of the ABC in the bushfires meant that it was going to play we thought it might play out in the election, and it did, and we campaigned. I know ABC Friends also did work in Eden Monaro. GetUp worked really, really hard to push the candidates to come out in support of the ABC, and they did. Kirsty McBain, it could be Christy McBain, I've never got it right, but Kirsty McBain stood side. I mean, it was like 2 days before the election. Stood side by side with Anthony Albanese, where he declared his party's support for the ABC, and said, "We will, if we get into government, restore the last round of cuts." And I thought, fantastic. Really fantastic, and it is. It's a great sentiment from the ALP, but. Actually, the round of cuts that he was referring to were actually on a triennial, a 3-year cycle, which meant that whenever he was going to get into Parliament, if he did, they'd be long gone and there'd be nothing to restore. It was a little bit of an empty promise. I think it's good to remember that the ALP is fantastic on narrative and bless them for it, but we actually need them to commit to a restoration of funding, not a maintenance. Not a maintenance, right? Because right now we're not in a good place. We need a restoration of funding, and so if you do have MPs who are Labor politicians, remember that we still have work to do there as well. It's really critical.
Thank you, Tosca. And on that note, I'm afraid the witching hour has arrived at 6:30, and I'm going to invite Michael Henry back to the podium to close off proceedings. And I'm sorry for those of you who had burning questions to ask. My bad. No doubt the panellists will stay back a bit for you for those burning questions. Please. We've been privileged to be here this evening. It's a comprehensive and provocative summary, and the challenge we face is clear. But firstly, can we really show our appreciation for the 4 panellists? And I'm sure you'll also join with me in specific appreciation, as you've seen in trying to get this panel to behave, the guiding hand
of Professor Andrea Hull. There are a number of others I would like to briefly thank on your behalf. The people behind the scenes, at the back of the hall, who have produced the event this evening and who will do the post-event work. The many volunteers who have managed the numerous tasks with administering and promoting. The teams at each of the 4 organisations that have designed, planned and promoted the event. And specifically Marcus May, our Vice President. Thank you all. Without Marcus, this event would not have happened, I can tell you. But most of all, on everyone's behalf, I'd like to thank you for being here this evening. We have an unabashed call to action for you. We are not at all humble about this. We ask that you join, donate and advocate. We ask you to join at least one of GetUp, ABC Friends and the MEAA, and join our various campaigns in support of the ABC. We ask that you donate to at least one of these organisations so that we can produce campaign materials and be confident in our planning for the next federal election. And we ask you to advocate on behalf of the ABC, to your friends, to your colleagues, to anyone who does or wants to represent you in Parliament. The next federal election is going to require a strong, non-partisan political campaign. We want to help people who support the ABC to get elected. And we want to do what we can to ensure that the people who do not support the ABC are not elected. As a tool to help you in this advocacy, as you leave the hall this evening, you will receive a full written response to the current government's position on the ABC, which was summarised in the 4 points from Mr. Frydenberg's office, which I read earlier. Also, we are launching a social media campaign on Monday titled, "Are You an ABC Friend? Take the Quiz." And we hope that you will visit the ABC Friends Victoria website on Monday and share it with your friends. So, can I just repeat, join, donate and advocate. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.